Welcome, everyone, to another YIVO Fellowship lecture brought to you by the Max Weinreich Institute at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. It's an institute within an institute. Our lecturer today is Jacqueline Nekhe Krass, who is a writer, translator, and PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work focuses on post-war Jewish American literature in English and Yiddish, situating it within the histories of multilingual writing, publishing, and translation in the United States. Her lecture today is entitled The Yiddish Patient, Postwar Illness and the Sanatorium in Daniel Charney's Oyfn Shvel von jener Welt. Great title, incidentally. And I just want to add, before we begin, we will have time for questions at the end. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A section of the Zoom, not the chat, but the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we will get to it. Sorry, I do want to add that this lecture has been supported with funds from the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship and the Vivian Lefsky Hort Memorial Fellowship. So please join me in welcoming Jacqueline Nekhe Krass.
Thank you so much, Eddie and Julia. I'm going to share my screen now. All right. So this is The Yiddish Patient, Postwar Illness and the Sanatorium in Daniel Charney's Often shvel von jener Welt, on the threshold of the other world or on the doorstep of the other world. And I'll just start by telling you a little bit about how I came to find Daniel Charney. It was an accident, as a lot of good things are. I was just looking in the Yiddish section of my university library several years ago, looking for books to practice Yiddish with. And I was looking for something ideally kind of short, something narrative. I thought it would be easier if it was set in America because it would have like less Russian and Slavic words. And I just found this thin blue book. This is my copy. You can see it's taped together at the edge. It was Daniel Charney's Often shvel von jener Welt. And I read it and I was just completely floored by it. And I've been thinking about it for several years since. It was a book about being in a tuberculosis sanatorium in the Catskills. It was a sanatorium run by the Arbeter Ring, which is also known as Workmen's Circle or Workers' Circle today. And my family used to have family reunions, actually, at the Workmen's Circle summer camp. So I was immediately interested. And I took the book home, and that was kind of the beginning of this many-year process for me that has involved translating as well as researching. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today. Daniel Charney really became a shtickler rebbe to me, like a bit of a rebbe for me, someone I've learned a lot from. So I'm going to talk today about the research I did into Charney and his archives at YIVO this past year, research I drew on for my dissertation chapter for my PhD. I'll start by telling you a little bit about Charney's biography, about this book, and share some of the interesting things from the archive and how they can deepen our understanding of this memoir about illness, American Jews, and the afterlife of the Holocaust. Thank you so much to Eddie and Julia and the whole staff of YIVO and the Center for Jewish History, especially the archive staff, for all their help and support in making this research possible. And as well, thank you to the Yiddish Book Center for supporting my translation of Charney's book into English. I'll be sharing little excerpts of that throughout the presentation. And thank you to Sunny Yidkaf, without whom this talk and so much else in my Yiddish life would not have happened. Okay, so this is Daniel Charney. I like that you can see in the corner, famous studio. It's a good name. I have this quote here from Often shvel: "Everyone who sees me is always ready to say Kaddish for their own past." So this is a quote. Charney is someone with a deep relationship to death. And I've turned this quote around in my head many times since first reading it. In a way, it doesn't make sense, right? You can't say Kaddish for your own past. You can't say Kaddish for yourself. There are a lot of different Kaddishes, but of course, the most well-known is the mourner's Kaddish, which requires a minyan of 10 Jews as well as a mourner. And traditionally, the mourner is ideally a son, if not a father, brother, husband, or grandson. Um, but Charney never had the opportunity to say Kaddish for his own father, who died of tuberculosis before Charney was born. And he also didn't have a son or any surviving biological children to say Kaddish for him, although he had two very beloved stepdaughters from his second wife. So who would say his Kaddish? According to this book and this quote, every American Jew with roots in Eastern Europe, or simply everyone, was going to say his Kaddish. The Ashkenazi Jewish past, Charney tells us, is an unresolved death and completely mourned. Its survivors are always ready to begin the mourning again. I want to argue here in Oyfn shvel, Charney's ailing survivor body becomes an emblem of post-Holocaust American Yiddish life. But why did the mere sight of Charney inspire these thoughts? The first reason is that Charney was sick his entire life. He had tuberculosis, which he describes dryly as the only inheritance he ever received from his father, as well as lupus, which seems to have mostly affected the skin of his right hand. And from a young age, he was traveling across all different cities across Europe, looking for the latest in medical treatment, as well as following around his older brothers because he was a youngest sibling. As you can see here, he was born in 1888 in Dukor, just a shtetl near Minsk in what was then the Russian Empire and is now Belarus. His father was Lubavitch Chassid, known as Chabad now, you might know them, and the children were raised in an observant household. His mother, Brocha, owned a small leather goods shop that his father had previously run. He had four older brothers and one older sister. All of them, except for Charney, went to Cheder, the traditional religious school for Jewish boys, and two of them, Borach and Shmuel, went on to yeshiva, where they were seen as prodigies. Because of his illness, though, Charney couldn't do any of that, so he had a private tutor, a Melamed, who would work with him one-on-one. And everyone around him believed from his birth that he would not survive to adulthood. He had actually survived two other siblings who had died as infants. This was pretty common in this time and place. But his mother was very devoted to him, a getraye Yiddish mama, and she did everything she could to take her youngest son to doctors as far away as the big city of Kyiv. And Charney survived. This would be a dominant narrative in his life. Eventually, all five brothers left their religious upbringings and emigrated to America. But as you can see from the dates, it took a couple tries for Charney. He first attempted immigration in 1925, but was sent back because of his tuberculosis. He has some really interesting articles about Ellis Island and being sent back. Eventually, he did successfully emigrate in 1941 from Nazi-occupied Paris. And in 1945, he entered the sanatorium in the Catskills, where he would write Oyfn shvel in velt. The book was first published serially in the Yiddish American newspaper Der Tog, and then the following year, presumably after success, because not every column gets made into a book, it was published as a book. He seems to have left the sanatorium and gone back multiple times in different periods. He finishes the book in Boston, which is where he's being treated at a different hospital that's closer to one of his daughters. But he keeps writing letters from and about liberty in the sanatorium all the way through 1957, only 2 years before his death. And throughout this all, he keeps up his writing. So the last book he published during his lifetime was in 1955, and then he had a book published posthumously in 1963. Here are some family photos. These are from different books of Charney's and of his brother, Vladik's, Borach Vladik. So we have in the center the five brothers. He describes them as like five fingers on a hand. So we have from right Borach, then Zalke, Shmuel in the middle, and Charney is the one on the left. You can see his right hand is hidden, right? You can't, as in every image photo of him, and then his brother Mendel. And then that's their wife, their mother Bracha on the left, sister Muriel, obviously from later on, much later on the right. That is actually with the gravestone of her late husband, who was also their uncle. And the house here above is, as the caption says, it's where Borach was born. It's also in one of Charney's books, so it seems likely to me that this is where they lived. And then on the right here, we have Borich and Shmuel in their kind of prime revolutionary era. So these two brothers would become big stars in the Yiddish world in a couple different iterations. They were both very active in leftist revolutionary groups, leading to the Russian Revolution of 1905. Borich was in the Bund and Shmuel was in Socialist Zionists. And they took on these pseudonyms in part because of their roles. After many different bouts of imprisonment, Shmuel almost died from torture. They ended up, like many people in their generation, turning to different arenas. Borich emigrates and becomes known as a socialist labor leader. He was, there is actually a housing project in New York named after him. He was a really interesting figure. And Shmuel becomes one of the founding figures of Yiddish literary criticism. So they're kind of the big famous, and then the other two brothers, Mendel and Zalka, have private lives. They are not known in the same way as the older two. So Charney's work often was cited as a footnote to these two older brothers' work. People use examples from his memoirs to illustrate something about their lives or give us information about how they grew up. But he also was in his own right a very successful writer with work published around the world in Yiddish newspapers and journals and with a legion of faithful readers. He also became a perpetual wanderer. So he started publishing poetry in Vilna, now Vilnius in Lithuania. He followed his brother Shmuel to Vienna and then to Bern in Switzerland, ended up stuck back in Eastern Europe with the outbreak of World War I. He flees Vilna for Moscow. He became an aid worker with Jewish refugees during the war, World War I. He marries, becomes a widower, spends years as a Soviet administrator who never joins the Communist Party, goes to Berlin, was there when Hitler came to power, flees to Paris, witnesses the Nazi occupation, and then finally, after all of this, escapes to New York via Lisbon. And this is his ship manifest. He and his wife here, when they do finally manage to flee to New York. He had tried many times in between all of this to return to Eastern Europe on a more permanent basis. He really wanted to be able to stay in Vilna, but was frequently deported because of his Soviet passport. So there's some interesting things to point out about this ship manifest. First, you can see there's alternate spelling for their last names. They have his wife is listed here as Sarah Chaya. Her gravestone says Chaya Sora, and he referred to her usually as Heikel, which is a diminutive of Chaya, or Anna in English. You can see that the ship comes from Lisbon, but none of the people on this ship list that manifest are from Lisbon. They're all mostly refugees. They're marked as Hebrew, right? That's the race or people. And although Charney is correctly listed as a writer, the language that he writes in Yiddish is not included, right? We have Russian, German, and French as he and his wife's languages. So this is all to say another reason that Charney becomes seen as an embodiment of this Ashkenazi past is because he lived in so many different parts of Europe, in so many different eras, revolutionary, World War I, communist, World War II, Nazi, and was deported or denied citizenship so many times. He's seen as this eternal kind of wandering Jew figure. And although he himself managed to survive World War II without having seen a concentration camp, most of his family, including his older sister Muriel and her children, who had stayed closer to their home shtetl, were murdered. And the intellectual Yiddish world that had fostered him was completely destroyed. So he also had a very deep acquaintance with loss. I'm going to turn now to Oyfn shvel, to the book, Charney's American book, what he wrote in the immediate wake of all that loss and migration and war. That was Oyfn shvel. This is a review of Oyfn shvel from the archive. I'll show you later where it comes from. And it has the subtitle, A Freilichen Buch wegen Tod, a happy book about death, which I think is a great way to sum up what Oyfn shvel is like. The word memoir here is a pretty loose term. It's really a collection of short essays documenting the first year or so of his stay at the sanatorium, written unlike obviously most memoirs today, week by week as this day was unfolding. If you take a writing class now, they'll usually tell you to wait a lot longer than that before you write about it. And also, unlike memoirs today, the book is not really about some inner journey that Charney goes through or an emotional arc from beginning to end. It's really about the other people around him. So mostly his other patients at the sanatorium, American Jews from all over the country. And we get to know them through conversations he has, some semi-journalistic, humorous anecdotes, these kind of brief moments in between being called to take their temperatures by these kind of omnipresent bells of the sanatorium that are always bringing them back to their places and preventing them from these connections. Through these people, Charney comes to something of a diagnosis of American Jewish life and its many contradictions, struggles, and surprises. So, like I said, the column was published in the Yiddish newspaper Der Tag that was based in New York. Charney had been writing there from them for years. And writing for Der Tag was a big source of income for him. I'll show you later some notebooks where he tallied up his income. But this was not what he was originally planning to write. He was actually in the process at the time that he was admitted to the sanatorium of writing a novel, serialized novel about a young wanderer named Mutka. And this is one of the installments of Mutka. So it's a little bit based on his life. Charney, Mutka gets caught up in the Second World War. He's living in Paris as Charney was. But unlike Charney, instead of escaping, Mutka joins the French army, which is a really fascinating lots of adventures ensue. He's placed in a troop with French colonial subjects, mostly North African. Really interesting stuff. But it was titled, as you can see here in the bottom of the subtitle, if you read Yiddish, Motka's Togbuch von jener Welt, Motka's Journal from the Other World. So Charney lifts the title from this project into the column that he ends up forced to write in the middle of this one about being treated for tuberculosis, often shvel von jener Welt. Later, he also uses this phrase to describe the German and Austrian Holocaust survivors that he meets at Mount Sinai Hospital. He describes them as delegates from the other world, Delegaten von jener Welt. So he's really playing here with this idea of the other world. Clearly, it's the world of death. That is how the phrase is usually used. And we have that in English, right? From the other world. But also Europe, because he's writing, right? Mutka here is writing from jener Welt. But it's also clearly the Jewish experience of the Holocaust and the war on the sort of other side of that experience. What does it mean? He's trying to figure out to be someone who has come from that other world, from the other side of death, and now has to figure out how to make a new life. So here is a quote from Oyfn Shvel. Charney's book and conversations offers insight into this moment in which language and phrases and forms about how to speak about the Holocaust are really still being formulated. It's a moment that I think there's some familiarity there, actually, because we're in a moment of turmoil. You don't have the language, things haven't crystallized. I think we can see that in a lot of different ways today. The book is full of all these people who are just starting to process what's happened to them and their families. So this is a friend of his who writes this quote that I have here, who is writing from Warsaw. And he says, "How can I express what I've been through to you when no language has yet devised the words with which to illustrate even a fraction of what happened to us? No ordinary person who had not seen it with his own eyes would believe it, and I understand him well, because I myself wouldn't have believed it. But it happened. The most terrible thing that could happen to a people and to our people." So the tone here, it's almost tragicomic. There's something that I find really striking about it, right? Like the writer can't help but say, to our people, right? And das grad mit unser Volk. There's almost this Borscht ring to it, as though it would have been fine if it just happened to someone else. But it's really a moment of shock where people, they just don't know exactly what this will mean and what it will, the fragments are so raw. So I think that's part of what's really interesting about this particular moment that Charney is writing about. And this is a postcard of the sanatorium that I really love. As you can see, this top image is the other side of the postcard. This is from Chaim Grada's papers. So someone who's been in the news a lot recently. He's a great Yiddish writer. And these are from his papers. Charney and he had wrote some letters back and forth. They seem to have had not necessarily a really close relationship, but they knew each other. If you're curious what the postcard says, Charney is gently teasing Grada, saying, you're already an American. Ihr seid schon geworden mit Mazel and Amerikanitz, because he has not responded to Charney's letter. And not only a letter, but he sent him a book, probably Charney's own book. And I love this postcard because it really illustrates a passage in Charney's book. And actually, the Oyfn shvel has in the very beginning a black and white version of this image. So just think about that while I read this. Wide, ample lawns stretch along the foot of the sanatorium like smooth green carpets dotted with fine-colored bouquets. These ample green lawns are fenced in on all sides by an unyielding and thorny bush, forming a low but very wide wall as though of barbed wire. In summertime, these wire-like bushes shoot out tiny, leafy, and mischievous branches that yearn toward the sun. Unfortunately, these unexpected shoots disrupt the bush's proletarian equality and fraternity, and so every Friday, just before Shabbos, the gardener goes around trimming and leveling them into a flat, uniform shape you could just about stroll on. This passage has some great characteristics of a classic Charney sentence. Paragraph. First, we have this wry, gentle, but clearly very ironic tone, which he was famous for. His love of analogy. He loves to use non-human things to talk about people. There's another passage where he compares the struggle between evergreens in the forest and the little plants that can't get enough sun because of them as a battle between nobles and workers. And we also have the fact that this analogy that he does make is through reference to clearly leftist and socialist language and ideology, the proletarian equality and fraternity. At the same time, I think it's pretty clear that he doesn't really like the sanatorium, or at least at first, or in this way. There's something really ruthless about the insistence on equality in this passage, which also can remind us that Charney lived through some very difficult periods in the Soviet Union from the very beginning, and through hunger and trials of some of his friends. So he has this idea of what this commitment to proletarian equality and fraternity above all else can do. Arbeter Ring, of course, is a socialist organization, so it's also appropriate in that way. Entry to the sanatorium was very cheap for members, although you didn't have to be one to join, to be treated there. But, and Charney is proud of this. He's a good leftist, but he's also kind of alienated. The sanatorium is clearly intended to be a beautiful and pleasant place for ailing proletariat workers to recover in good air, but it's not completely free, it seems. The lawns are fenced in, and the bush has taken on the appearance of barbed wire, an image I think is impossible not to link with concentration camps. Charney knows he's here to be healed, or at least treated, because he tells us at this time there is no treatment for tuberculosis. But he can't stop seeing his institutionalization as a kind of incarceration. On his first night at the sanatorium, he's so disturbed by the laundry smokestack that looks to him like a crematorium chimney that he can't sleep. So we have this juxtaposition of his light tone and this really heavy darkness from the very beginning here. And we can really see that in some of these qualities in the image of the sanatorium, which is very pristine and pretty. We can see the extensive labor that must go into maintaining its grounds, and also the lack of individuality. There are no people in the image. It's there's no room for a poet like Charney, who, as he tells us elsewhere, is not exactly a proletarian, because poets are generally classless creatures. So next image, it's not a great quality, but I love this photo and I wanted to share it with you. This is Charney in the sanatorium that you just saw. He is smoking a cigarette. It's 1950. That's what the caption says. At his writing desk, he's wearing, apparently, it looks like a bathrobe. He's probably in bed. You can see he's kind of made himself at home here. He's been at the sanatorium off and on for several years by now. He's got, looks like maybe a calendar in the back. He's got some decorations. And of course, this man had tuberculosis his entire life. Tuberculosis affects the lungs. He obviously should not have been smoking, but he seems to have really loved it. He derived great joy from smoking and drinking coffee. So we have this quote at the bottom, which is also from Oyfn shvel. If, God forbid, I really did give up those two bad habits, that is, smoking and writing, then I would no longer be a man at all, and life would no longer be worth living. This is what he tells us after he has, at the beginning of the memoir, when he has a intake interview with a doctor at the sanatorium, and he has to promise the doctor that he won't smoke, but also that he won't write. Writing is seen as bad for him. New York editorial offices have made me sick, he says. And he promises that he will not, of course, knowing the whole time that he will. So we have that kind of boyish charm, very reminiscent of some Sholem Aleichem stories, this kind of impishness that he has throughout his whole life. And on the side here, we have two letters that he wrote on sanatorium stationery. These are from the archive. I was really excited to find these the stationery when I first went to the archive. You can see just there's something very concrete about it, about writing on this letterhead. Of course, as I realized soon, there is a ton of letters. He has tons and tons of letters saved on this letterhead because he spent so much time there. So the one on the right is to his wife, Heikel Serze, trying to calm her down, and reminding her that we've both survived quite well for 30 years. I think that means 30 years of marriage. And it's a wonder that we're still here. He reminds her that many of their friends are now often olam ha'emes in the true world. The one on the left here, also from Charney, is from the same year as the photo was taken. That's to his sister-in-law, Clara Vladik, who was then the widow of his beloved older brother, Vladik. And the two seem to have had a good relationship. He uses the familiar pronoun with her. It's very affectionate. The letters really show how Charney maintained a relationship with the outside world from the sanatorium and how the outside world maintained its relationship with him. He tells Clara that he's received so many greeting cards for the Jewish New Year with good wishes on his behalf from all over the world that if God really listens to them, he'll definitely send Charney another 7 years of creativity, which is what he's really hoping for. He wants to get to 70. It's a quip that reminds me of my great aunt, Rona of blessed memory. He says to her, "Everything is backwards with me. Bei mir ist doch alles kaputt. For my 63 years, 36. Today, I really feel like a 36-year-old because I don't count those previous 27 years of my life to date, which I spent in all those different hospitals, clinics, and sanatoriums." So during all that time, Charney wrote a lot of letters. The famous Yiddish poet mementos claimed that, in fact, Charney's whole body of work could be seen as just the form of a letter, written from the heart directly to his reader. He wrote, Charney actually wrote only letters. His columns were letters to his readers, and he had them in masses. His memoirs were letters, and even his poems, too, were just as intimate and as direct as letters. His letters possessed not just letters of the alphabet and written words, but a voice, a deep voice, a world-wise voice. More than once I thought banally, his sincerity originates in no other place but from the fact that when you write with your left hand, you write directly from the heart. So here, Charney's qualities of sincerity, or hartsigkeit, literally like heartness, intimacy, and wisdom are depicted as deeply connected to his physical disability, the lupus that caused the use of his non-dominant hand. Ravitch artfully draws together Charney's popularity, his literary style, and the fact of his disability, suggesting that the first two actually stem from the third, which is not really a disability, but actually a super ability, this handicap that makes him a better writer. So it's a questionable conclusion, but an interesting one. But what I really like is this idea of Charney's work as essentially epistolary, one long process of letter writing, especially because there are so many letters in his archive. He spent so much of his life writing letters and receiving them. And it makes sense because he was spending so much time in these institutions, away from his family and friends, and lived in so many different places with family and friends and colleagues who were scattered all over the world. He claims that he had readers in every continent. That letters were a crucial way for him to stay in touch with the people he loved. And here are just some examples of different stationery. Over the years, there's the one on the bottom right is the oldest. That one's from 1908, and that is a postcard that he wrote from Vienna. We also have places as different as New Jersey, Freehold, New Jersey, Montreal, Badenweiler in the top left. That was a health spa in the Black Forest, near the Black Forest that he was treated at, where Shalom Aleichem and Chekhov were also treated. On the right, that's his stationery from Paris. And in the middle, you see the different iterations of Workman Circle Sanatorium stationery, because he, again, was there for so long. You see, he went through different medical directors, from Harold Teitenboim to Samuel Lipstein. And in this third one, you can see also it has the Yiddish. It has Yiddish letters in it saying Arbeter Ring Sanatorium. It's the same thing as the English. But you can see how the Yiddish actually disappears in the later stationery. I think it's very, it's, to me, just makes me think about what that must have been like to be writing in Yiddish as a Yiddishist on the stationery that the Yiddish is kind of being taken away from, it's disappearing. One other really positive surprise for me when I was working in the archive was how many letters there were between Charney and his wife. Because although he is known as a memoir, as I told you, his memoirs aren't exactly personal in this way that we see in a contemporary memoir. So we really see that more in his poetry, but his memoirs fit more into this older model of autobiographical writing. That's about the time period he lived through and his experiences. Walter Mosley, the scholar of Jewish autobiography, writes that this is a kind of a Russian form of a Rousseauian autobiographical writing. So in which both the natural, familial, and wider socio-historical environment, the other, in short, is accorded a far greater role in accounts of the becoming and being of the self. And so we really get very little about Charney's wife in all of his books, which is a little unfair because he does write about his first wife, Rachel, who he met in the Soviet Union and died young with their child. But Heikel is really just a shadow in the books themselves. She's kind of at the margins. This quote in the center is from Oyfn shvel. This is sort of rare sighting of her. This is when he's gotten admitted to a special surgical clinic at Mount Sinai toward the end of the book in New York. And he describes how his wife is sent away from the hospital with his clothes in a paper bag to bring home. It's clearly quite devastating for him. Once relieved of his clothes, Charney tells us, the naked patient receives from the nurse a hospital shirt with a few sets of hospital drawers in various sizes and colors, and a hospital gown without a belt, and thereby becomes the perfect patient. He is the English in the Yiddish patient. While the wife who'd escorted her sick husband to the hospital gets her husband back from that same nurse, but packed up into a paper bag. In this bag, which the woman carries home with her, is actually her husband, his shoes, his under and overclothes, even his hat. All that's missing are his flesh and bones. So watching his wife walk away with all of his identifying garments, all the ways that he fashioned himself as an individual and a creative person, Charney feels like an almost dead person watching his wife being prepared for widowhood. It's probably the darkest moment in this book. He says he wants to cry my eyes out over the tragic fate of my wife and her paper man sack. Wives are very important in Oyfn shvel. The word in different iterations of the word for wife in Yiddish appears 99 times in the book, but they almost never get to speak for themselves, in part because the patients at the sanatorium, they're divided by gender. So most of Charney's interlocutors are other men. And this story, while moving to me, it doesn't tell us a lot about the actual experience of Charney's wife, the internal experience of what she was like. So I was really excited to find these huge stacks of postcards and letters between them, which I'm hoping to work on in the future. And in the archives, you can see these are postcards on little like index paper sized slips here from divided up by year. You can see in the 1948 is from Liberty, 1947 is Brooklyn, 1943 is Brooklyn. It makes sense, again, because they spent so much time apart. In 1949, which seems to have been an apex of letter writing for them, Charney sent Chaya over 70 letters on sanatorium stationery and 89 postcards. His letters to her show that she worries about him. He often is telling her to be ruhig or calm, sends him packages with nuts and sweets, visits, travels among friends, and spends time with their daughter and grandchildren. They had one daughter who was in America and another daughter who was in the Soviet Union and didn't emigrate till much later. Moving between parts of Brooklyn seems like traveling to the country in this time. In one letter, Charney advises Chaya to rent a room in Seagate or Brighton for the summer months, the way another kind of city dweller might take a cottage upstate. The couple lived in Windsor Terrace. You can see the address there, 176 Sealy Street, which is about a 28-minute drive from Seagate today. But I think it's you can feel the kind of what they've been through together in these letters, and her faithfulness to him. I mean, she must have kept all of these letters, obviously, because they're from him to her, in maintaining his archive. So I'm almost done here, but I just wanted to show a few more things that I love that I found in the archive. The first is this composition notebook. So this is one of the first items I saw in the archive, in Charney's archive. And I was so excited to find it because it felt like he was really saving it for me, for a scholar in the future. It is, as you can see, an American composition notebook that he has turned upside down so it can read from right to left. And he's written auf den Schwelfen jener Welt, recensies und Yiddish Artikeln. So auf den Schwelfen jener Welt, reviews and Jubilee articles, because this is also coincided with his 60th birthday. So I don't know, it tickles me, and I find it really touching as well because it's such a simple object. It's not made for him to write left to right and right to left, and of course, but he's flipped it on its head to be of use. At the same time, it has that boyishness of his writing that he's using this composition notebook. And within, he's pasted in, like a photo album or something, all of his reviews of Auf den Schwelfen jener Welt. So, and you can see he's kind of very carefully folded some of the pieces for the longer articles, like this bottom left image. So you're peeling open different little pieces of paper as you read through it. And it was an amazing compendium for me of what people were writing about the book in this time. People always describe it and him in reference to his health, right? Not of body, but of spirit and mind. One writer, Bialystotsky, writes, Charney is a healthy writer, though he himself has had to spend many times in sanatoriums. And the reviewer claims Charney has even achieved a kind of immunity that even the tragic events of the past years have not punctured. He has remained whole, not broken. Other critics actually proposed the book itself as a cure. One, Moshe Starkman, writes that Jewish doctors should keep copies of Charney's new book in their waiting rooms, hypothesizing that a patient who read through even a small section of Charney's account of sanatorium and hospital stays would ultimately abridge his time with the doctors itself. This is really striking to me, especially because Charney complains about the American insistence on the writer as doctor, not only as artist or creator. In America, he writes, the writer must be a doctor of the soul. He can't just entertain, he has to take care of the reader, especially at this particular moment as a Jewish writer, as a Yiddish writer. And Charney took this mission very seriously. So here is, this is the first book of the composition, the first page of the composition notebook. Originally, it looks like he was going to write his journal in it. He's got Tagebuch von Sanatorium für Lungenkranke, a journal for the sanatorium for lung patients, pulmonary, and then Liberty, New York, 1945. But then he's crossed it out and decided to use it for reviews instead. This is another close-up. He has some comments telling the reader where things are from, what newspaper. He has some comments here. And then the final image I want to show you is just these pocket diaries that these are also really wonderful to work with in the archive. He wrote in all these kinds of little tiny notebooks over the years. They're actually very useful for checking dates for me. So that was like a functional purpose. Some of them, he has a lot of little agendas for by year. And also can see how writers were paid because he kept pretty meticulous notes on in the top right here about his income. But again, it's kind of on the bottom left. He has this is his draft of a poem about his late brother Baruch, who and his how much he adored him and his really deep grief at Baruch's death. This is a close-up. So towards the end of Oyfn shvel, Charney goes on, I remind everyone of something of their own then, and that's why perhaps my readers are always so God of mercy-ish to me. He's staying on the grounds of the Boston State Hospital, just as a visitor for the first time, for once, not a patient. And immediately afterward, the gardener of the hospital comes to speak to Charney because turns out he grew up in the same area of Eastern Europe as Charney in Minsk, and they actually was part of the same leftist political movements as Charney's brothers there. Turns out they have friends in common, they talk about it. And Charney writes, he used to meet them often, even in America, these friends, Yiddish writers, Aleph Litvin and Aleph Liesen. Charney tells us, but they're now on divergent paths, and he's never been in the same place with all of them long enough to get a photograph together. Oyfn shvel is a work of post-war literature that's trying to imagine a Jewish future in America through a deep and very often very funny memorialization of its immediate past. Its protagonist, like the people and language its author comes to embody, is at once dead and alive, frozen on the threshold, on this embody, the doorstep Oyfn shvel. Will they be let in? Do they want to be? From this vantage point, Charney shows us how American culture came to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was really, really interesting for a couple of reasons. We have a couple of questions in the chat that we'll get to. I just wanted to quickly ask some of my own questions, things that came up. One of the things I really appreciated was the material from Evo's archives that you showed. That's really, from the the sort of written documents themselves to the tiny diaries and his income and all of that sort of ephemera of life that winds up in archives can be, so fascinating and add to a researcher's um, arsenal when they're trying to figure out who this person was and why they were doing what they did. Um, so this phenomenon of the tuberculosis sanatorium, it's not new in Yiddish literature. I think stereotypically, you know, I think Yiddish writers and poets were known to have gone to these places. I think, even I've read that the tuberculosis was considered at the time a kind of Jewish disease. So that's interesting in and of itself. And of course, you had um, Chaim Spivak helped found this the tuberculosis sanatorium in Denver. Uh, this is obviously before the war, and the poet Yehoyash was there, and Hay Leivik was there. And so one of the things I wanted to ask was uh, if Charney had sort of a literary circle in this place, or if he was just entirely alone.
Yeah, so of course, yes. So definitely there's been some really good research. There are two books specifically about Yiddish literature and sanatoriums, Sonny Yidkoff's book and Sandra Gilman, that talk a lot more about the Denver sanatorium. It does seem, Sonny suggests that there was much more of a literary milieu there, and that was part of their approach to medicine too. Whereas obviously from Charney's interview with the doctor at the Workmen Circle, they're very anti-writing, and the idea that this could make you sick. So it does seem like he is more isolated as a writer there. But he also, I mean, because of the letters, he's sending material about being at the sanatorium, poems to Leivik. They're in conversation. I can't remember if it was Leivik or Yehoyash who was briefly at the Workman Circle Sanatorium as well. And there's also a book that he helped a fellow patient publish in Yiddish after, who was not like a professional writer that Charney had just met and helped him write something. So he definitely did his part in spreading it at Workman Circle, but it does seem like he was really, it was a very different scene that way.
Right, right. And I have to say that what one interesting thing you have that you showed that photo of him, smoking and writing, and these were the two things that the doctors asked him not to do, and clearly he didn't listen to them at all. Um, but it was surprising to me that they considered writing to be bad for one's health, and I'm just curious, where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. I think there is. I think the novel Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann is a clear influence on Charney. It's sort of the sanatorium novel of European literature. And I think there's some, that gives you a sense of some of that, the ethos of someone in a sanatorium has to relax. It's really important for them not to be, to get worked up. The people in Thomas Mann's novel are always in danger of getting their temperature too high. And there are all these moments in often shvel where people have to leave and go take their temperatures. So I think that's, one aspect of it. Um, I mean, certainly the idea that New York has made people sick in that time, that's very common. People have to go into the fresh air. It's part of the allure of the Catskills, get out of the kind of crowded tenements. So it does, it's partially with that. But I think I think it's this idea that the tuberculosis patient has to rest and that can't do anything that would get him kind of riled up in any way. But it does seem like Charney was kind of like a special patient. Like he definitely got special privileges, um, and kind of got to break some rules, it seems like.
Right. I mean, it's to ask a writer not to write is,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know how that's going to succeed ever.
Yeah.
In any case, we'll get to the audience questions. And if anyone does have a question, please put it in the Q&A section of the Zoom. Um, and the first question we have is who saved all those letters and apparently collected them? Um, so this is a good question for maybe for an archivist, but maybe the sort of provenance of all this material and might want to talk about it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I have a guess that, I mean, clearly his wife was collecting a lot of this material because there's so much from him, which you don't always find in an archive. You often find things written to someone, at least in like other like non-Yiddish, like contemporary archives that I've worked in. So I think definitely his wife, but I think also he was really it was important to him to collect these letters. I mean, I didn't even really get into all the letters he has in other people's archives at YIVO. It's just like massively, he's everywhere. But he definitely collected them consciously. He has some article that he wrote in the 30s where he talks about his a Briefregister, like a registry of letters that he's kept, an archive of like thousands of letters from the last 15 years. And he's very proud to have a letter from Paris and from Shalom Aleichem, who we knew a little bit. So I think it seems to me like part of his kind of Yiddishist cultural mission, as well as like, I don't know, maybe his own, his career. And he'll like take notes on people who've written nice things about his books. And I think it's a mix of those things. But my sense is a lot of it is him and his wife.
Makes sense. Um, Another question we have is they ask if you'd say a bit more about the connection between worker circles and sanatoria.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot more to say about it, besides just, um, he was a member of Workman Circle, and um, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a Jewish institution, but they mostly Christian nurses, it seems, at least from the book. So there's a lot about like those kinds of miscommunications. And I think it also just informs, the people that he talks to are people who are mostly members of Workman Circle, um, which is also, had a strong Yiddish component, of course, as you can see in the stationery and just for their reputation. So I think definitely There's the idea that tuberculosis is a Jewish disease and also that it's a workers' disease because it's so associated with these kind of impoverished contexts in New York City. So I think that's probably one reason that it was made sense for them to have this.
Right. Do you have any sense who funded this extended stay?
That's a great question. I don't.
No, but like, really, I mean, when you were talking about his his sort of peripatetic life as a writer, I thought to myself, how is this guy supporting himself? It was really, really curious. But then also to have an extended stay in a place like this requires funding, and it's just a curious why how this happened.
Right. And he wasn't residential the whole time. He has other letters kind of looking for apartments and like staying in different kind of inns in the area. But yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. Definitely, he was writing very constantly through all of this. I'm sure that's one aspect that he was supporting himself and his wife, and had these kind of long-standing columns that he was writing. It's published all over the place. And so I think, that was how he was supporting himself. I don't know. I haven't seen like for other Yiddish writers, you'll see kind of committees that might get together to raise money for them or something. Um, Monger is one that I came across. It's famously bad with money, but he it seems like he supported himself with writing. That's kind of the best I know of it.
Okay. Um, we have a question from Elena Hoffenberg, who was one of this year's cohort of YIVO fellows as well. Um, Somewhat long, but it has to do with his Charney's ability to imagine women as anything other than wives. You said that you mentioned that uses the term over 100 times, and what is his ability to portray women other than in this way?
It's limited for sure. It's a good question. It's one of the kind of constant disappointments of reading someone of this generation and time. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of so he's really into the mushal, this kind of fable or sort of parable that has roots in rabbinic discourse. And there are a lot of mashalim about people's wives. And I don't, he has this long-standing thing in his books about kind of flirting with the nurses and kind of like playing out little love affairs with them. And so, it definitely seems like that is his primary way of interacting with them. As that, and then also as the ones who are Christians, that's like obviously a big part of how, and they're interacting with him and realizing that he's a refugee. And that has a particular meaning for them in this moment. Maybe they've read about the refugees, and kind of like when the nurse comes in when he can't sleep on that first night, and she says, "Are you a refugee?" He uses the English word in the Yiddish, and brings him milk. That's like the only thing she can really do because lights are supposed to be out from the sanatorium. So yeah, I think it's really limited. I mean, yeah.
Okay. We have another question from Elisa Sampson, and she asks if Charney discovered the typewriter and carbon paper, um, ready to keep copies of the letters he sent. I mean, this is an interesting question because the typewriter was this technology that allowed for faster writing. I mean, I think you only showed us handwritten material. So is there any indication that he used a typewriter?
Yeah, definitely he used it, but it's a good question because it does not seem to be his preferred method of writing. And I don't know if that had to do with moving around a lot or his abilities with his hands or what it was, but he certainly has letters, and especially like more formal business letters, maybe. Um, that might also be part of his kind of parnosa. He was like administrator in different kind of organizations, literary groups. But yeah, it's not his preference for sure.
Um, Okay, here's a really interesting question. The quote about his presence stirring people to say Kaddish for their own past, plus the haunted quality of the passage you shared, do you have a sense of him from his letters as a kind of haunted person? Perhaps someone who lived when all the odds would have led to his having died much earlier in his life.
Yeah, so I mean, I think anyone who survived all those things certainly would have some element of haunting, but I mean, there's almost this like insistent kind of quality to the way that everyone writes about him as like not a haunted person, not someone who's been embittered or made angry, or, he's this very happy and lively and cheerful person who's always trying to like encourage people and cheer people up, and doesn't take himself too seriously. He loves to describe himself as, he'll always ask questions tamavata, like a fool, a tom. He kind of makes himself like very naive in the questions that he asks people, which is very effective for getting them also to like open up to him. So I think that's part of what's kind of magical about him for as a writer, that he, without denying that all of that kind of devastation and suffering. I mean, the part in Mount Sinai when he's obviously really sick and has to have surgery is really, it's very sad. And the rest of the book really isn't in that way, because he has this kind of lightness of spirit, this like pluckiness that again made me think of like Sholem Aleicham's Mottel. It's like whatever happens, he's kind of just like happy to be there, and he always like he's kind of interested, and that really carries him far, just being interested in things. Um, so I think like, so yeah, it's clearly it's something he's constantly thinking about, and um there's some guilt that he has, certainly, because he says, here I am lying in a comfortable bed in the sanatorium where there's an extra bed right across from me, and my last remaining relative in all of Europe is in a DP camp. So there's, so all those kinds of emotions that were like you would expect from someone who's survived all these things, but he's able to temper it in this way that's really appealing and probably healthy too.
Interesting. All right, we're almost out of time. So we'll just go to one more question, and this could be kind of broad. Um, the Someone was curious about how you came to study Charney. I think you said that in the beginning a bit, and where your interest in Yiddish studies began. So maybe you could sort of just make, create
Yeah.
this capsule.
Yeah. And I'll also just add, Ezra asked about lupus, and that is something that hadn't been confirmed before. But doing the research, he's clearly was treated at lupus institutes in Europe, and writes about having lupus in some of his letters. So we can talk more about that, but that's where that's from. And yeah, in terms of my interest in Yiddish studies, it's really my professor kind of suggested it to me when I got to grad school. I was doing something completely different, American contemporary literature and poetry. But I was interested, my family, it's like kind of a classic story, but my Nekhe is my great-grandmother's Yiddish name. And I had always heard about my communist Yiddish-speaking great-grandparents on my dad's side, and was really curious about them and who they were, what it meant that they say that my great-grandfather had been a revolutionary. Like, what does that mean? And I got a good sense of it. That was part of what's so exciting about Charney, is like you can see, oh yeah, all of these young boys in this like early 1900s are leaving traditional homes and becoming parts of these leftist groups. Like that was kind of a generational experience. So it just became easier to understand who they were in that way. And I just started and really loved Yiddish. And there were so many things that kind of hit on things I was already interested in. There's so much American Yiddish poetry. It's actually like a really important genre, whereas in American literature, poetry is not always like the most, it's kind of like a little off to the side. So yeah, I just kind of got bit by it.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been Jacqueline Nekhe Krass, uh, giving her paper on Daniel Charney for the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship and the Vivian Lefsky Hort Memorial Fellowship, both to whom we are indebted for providing funds for fellows like this. And if you do like what you hear and would like to hear more, please consider making a donation because YIVO can't bring scholars to our archives, and we can't bring you these the results, these talks, if we don't have funding. So we very much appreciate that. We also have, I think in the next 3 weeks, one fellowship talk per week. So if this is of interest to you, please check our online schedule at yivo.org, and you can see when these lectures are. So again, once again, thanks so much, Jackie, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much for coming.